Directors with the apostrophe after the S forum, co-sponsored by the Journalism School and the Center, is it on public diplomacy? It is a delight for me to introduce the moderator of this program. But before I do that, I want to say that I had the pleasure of having dinner last night with the panel and a couple of our spouses and friends, and this is a terrific group, and I am honored that Phil Seib, my co-director here, has put this together. It really, if there was a more interesting conversation in the United States last night than the one we had at dinner, I'd be amazed. So, Phil Seib, who is a member of my faculty at the Journalism School, is the director of the Center on Public Diplomacy and a professor of Public Diplomacy and International Relations. So he has a full agenda. He also is an author of many books. His research focuses partly on the effects of news coverage on diplomacy, so he couldn't be more appropriate in the job he's in. He's taught here for 2 years, and before that was at Marquette, and before that at Southern Methodist University. Written many interesting books. The next most recent of which is called Al Jazeera Effect. Very interesting book that we had a director this morning on here last year. So I will turn the program over to Phil with my ardent thanks for putting together such a terrific program.
Today's topic, Iran, New Politics, New Media. The title is simple, but was chosen with some care. The phenomenon in Iran after the elections there earlier this year is fascinating on several levels. One, of course, is the political level and the efforts of people with a great history. This is Persia, after all, trying to assert themselves and assert themselves on behalf of the future of their country. So as a political story, it's fascinating just in itself. But also, particularly for the purposes of the Annenberg School, it is fascinating because of the use of media. The use of social media, of Twitter and Facebook and cell phones and instant messaging and all that, melded with the politics of the moment to transform those politics. And I think we can, although we watch Iran develop its future both with some trepidation and some hopefulness, I think it's important to recognize that the political transformation spurred by media that occurred there will not be limited to Iran. What we're seeing is a paradigm that presumably will affect elections and the political process generally around the world. We're delighted today to have a panel with different outlooks, different backgrounds, and some different perspectives on events there. To my right is Roger Cohen, a columnist for the New York Times, who wrote magnificent columns from Iran before, I guess, were you kicked out, or did you just leave?
Somewhere between the two.
Okay. But if you haven't read Roger's work, and he also appears in the New York Times opinion pages now, I urge you to read him. On my far left is Mike Shuster, diplomatic correspondent of National Public Radio, who also covered events in Iran. And to my immediate left is Mahasti Afshar, who lives in Los Angeles, but has spent much of the past several months monitoring Twitter and other new media traffic coming out of Iran. So we have different viewpoints to take a look at what has transpired in Iran, what it means to the media, what it means to the public, what it means to the future. And we'll start with Roger.
Thank you very much, Phil. And thank you, Geneva, for inviting us. I've been back now from Iran, my 15 days in Iran for a couple of months. And that was my second visit this year. And I'm still inhabited by what happened there. It's a story, an event that I find very hard to get over. And I think it was overwhelming because in the space of the 15 days I was there, the contrast was so enormous between the festive Tehran, the festive Iran, in which I arrived 3 days before the election, with great street parties unfurling, the Musavi, the opposition leaders' movement, growing by the day, but much more than that, just the respect, the democratic sophistication of the debate that was going on. There were Ahmadinejad supporters, Karubi supporters, all respecting each other, all out there. And in the day of silence, before the vote, the silence was observed. All the posters came down, the debate stopped. This was an election that, if there was any doubt about it, demonstrated to me, incontrovertibly, that the Iranian people, if any people is ready for democracy, or at least for a far greater degree of democracy, it is the Iranian people. They know what goes into a pluralistic system. They've been questing for it since 1905, when the constitutional revolution occurred. And through all the back and forth, various forms of autocracy that have gone on since then, that quest has never died. And then, on the Saturday morning, I woke up to a city that was being terrorized. All that festivity just evaporated, as if it had been some conjurer's trick, as if Iranians were merely puppets in the hands of some malevolent puppeteer. And down at the Interior Ministry that morning, riot police of various kinds were simply pouring out of the building. The Musavi headquarters had been turned upside down. A woman, I'll never forget her, came running towards me, crying, saying, "Put down your notebook, put down your notebook, come and help us. This is a putsch." And, there's some debate still here in this country as to whether, perhaps President Ahmadinejad might in fact have won this election. After all, he had all the means of the state at his disposal. He'd gone to every village in Iran. Weren't we deluded by the sophisticated people of northern Tehran into believing this? And, I think in journalism, the numbers count, the statistics count. You can look at the sheer preposterousness of the Ahmadinejad numbers. He won 5 million votes in the first round in 2005. Suddenly he jumps to 25 million in the midst of an economic crisis. You can look at the fact that the number that was announced at 1 in the morning, when counting had just begun, when his victory was formally announced by the state news agency IRNA, this 64 or so percent never wavered across regions of complete and dramatic social and ethnic diversity. The line just went like that. There are so many indications of what I believe to have been a very clear electoral fraud. But in the end, what is it that tells me that? It's what I felt on the street that morning, and that's why the aspiring journalists among you, it is so important to get out there still, despite all the new media that exists. It's only on the street of Tehran that day that you felt that something was rotten in the state of Iran. It was the fear, it was this massive show of force. If you have 2/3 of the people behind you, if you've just won by a massive margin, why do you need this colossal display of force? Why were people being terrorized in front of my eyes? And that terror continued more or less uninterruptedly over the 11 or 12 days that I was there after the election. And leaving was extremely hard. Most people had to leave before I did. I happened to have a longer visa than most people, and I arrived just before the election. So in the last 5 days, I was more or less the only US reporter still left there, and I was getting very little sleep. And, I felt that leaving was a kind of betrayal. That may sound odd, shouldn't I have just felt relief to get out of there when I got on the plane? I didn't. I felt, it was a betrayal of the women I'd seen being beaten until they were bleeding, of the hope of the 3 million people who were in the streets the Monday after the election. And I felt that as a journalist, as a columnist, my job was to bear witness and to go on bearing witness for as long as I could. And I ignored the revocation. Everybody's press pass was revoked within days of the election. And I just took the view that I would carry on until I was stopped. And I did think of staying even beyond my visa. But in the end, opted not to take that course, which I'm sure would simply have landed me in Evin prison, which probably wouldn't have helped anything. Anyway, when I got back, I tried to sort of write down what I felt about this issue of bearing witness and why it's still so important to be on the ground despite all the new forms of new media. And I wrote a column called The Journalist's Actual Responsibility. And I'd just like to quote from it very briefly, because I think it gets us to the heart of some of what we're trying to debate today. And I wrote, to be a journalist is to bear witness. The rest is no more than ornamentation. To bear witness means being there, and that's not free. No search engine gives you the smell of a crime, the tremor in the air, the eyes that smolder, or the cadence of a scream. No news aggregator tells of the ravaged city exhaling in the dusk, nor summons the defiant cries that rise into the night. No miracle of technology renders the lip-drying taste of fear. No algorithm captures the hush of dignity, nor evokes the adrenaline rush of courage coalescing, nor traces the fresh, raw line of a welt. Of course, the role played by other forms of media was tremendously important. And I also wrote in that column, of course, Iranians have borne witness with cell phone video images, with photographs, through Twitter and other forms of social networking, and have thereby amassed an ineffaceable global indictment of the usurpers of June 12. Never again will Ahmadinejad speak of justice without being undone by the Neda effect, the image of eyes blanking, life abating, and blood blotching across the face of Neda Aga Sultan, who, as you all know, is a young student, age 26, whose death was captured on video that went viral. Now, this column earned me the wrath of Ariana Huffington, no less, who wrote the next, a couple of days later, how bizarre it is that Cohen chooses to attack the tools of new media-fueled reporting by citing the very event that highlights the power of those tools and the weaknesses of his argument. Indeed, search engines, news aggregation, live blogging, and miracles of technology such as Twitter, Facebook, and real-time video delivered via camera phones played an indispensable part in allowing millions of people around the world to bear witness to what was happening in Iran. The truth is, she wrote, you don't have to be there to bear witness. You don't have to be there to bear witness. And you can be there and fail to bear witness. Well, I wouldn't argue with the second part of that sentence, but I certainly would argue with the first. I think Ariana and I are just going to have to differ. I don't think I was belittling the role played by new media, but I think there are limits to that usefulness. Twitter advertises itself as follows: share and discover what's happening right now, anywhere in the world. Well, yes, that's true up to a point, but is Twitter and the other forms of new media, is this journalism? Well, it's certainly a formidable system of alerting people to a breaking story, as when a plane crashes in the Hudson or somebody gets killed in Tehran. It's a very powerful organizing tool. It was very hard for the people in Tehran to organize demonstrations, because as soon as you went down to a demonstration area, what happened? Your cell phone got cut off, and texting had got cut off the night of the election. And communication was very difficult. In fact, I called Tehran at that point a city of whispers, because as soon as you gathered anywhere, what would you hear? Tomorrow, Vali Asa. Tomorrow, Ferdowsi Square. Tomorrow, Azadi. And through some miracle of whispers, people learned in the city where to communicate. But Twitter certainly did help. And more than that, it helped people outside Iran reorganize their image of Iran. If you said Iran, 6 months ago when I was there in June, what was the image that came to people's minds? It was a bearded mullah, most probably with a finger on a nuclear button. What is the word Iran summon in people's minds today? And I think largely thanks to new media and Twitter, it is young and sophisticated. 65% of Iranians are under 35. It is a young, plugged-in society that is laboring under a regime that is going in an opposite direction from the direction in which most people is going, which is why the long-term future of the Islamic Republic, I think, has to be under question, especially after what happened June 12. What else is Twitter? It's certainly also a potent means of monitoring, of keeping journalists honest. I mean, when CNN's coverage in the couple of days after the election was not as intense as a lot of people believed it should be, there was a lot of complaints about that in the new media, and I think that too is very important. It's a very effective means to deliver a message, and I think if Obama's new soft power diplomacy is going to be as effective as the way he used new media during the campaign, then he is going to have to, the administration is going to have to master this in new ways. It's a remarkable archive. I mean, historians are going to be turning to all these recordings, clips, and so on. One image of all those demonstrations was just people with cell phones, going like this. I mean, that by the time I left was all that was left. Everybody else had been kicked out. And it's, of course, a terrific means to get linked, to find the right links, to get linked to the stories you want to read. But, journalism, in the end, is something else. It's not just a kind of here comes everybody, in Clay Shirky's important phrase, deluge of raw material. In fact, I'd say the essence of journalism is distillation. It's an organizing intelligence. It's an organizing sensibility. It's a choice of material, whether in words or image. And how is that choice made? It's made in pursuit of presenting the truest, the fairest, the most vivid, and the most complete picture of a situation. That, at least, is what I was trained to do. And part of that choice lies in something that's ineffable. The air you breathe, the sounds you hear, the flavors you taste, the shadows that fall across somebody's eyes when you are there. Contrary to Arianna Huffington, you have to be there to bear witness. And in that sense, I think the miracles of technology, Twitter, Facebook, live blogging, search engines, expand the raw material of journalism and the means to deliver journalism exponentially, beyond anything I could imagine when I started in the 70s. But they are not, and they can't be, a substitute for what Martha Gellhorn, the great World War II journalist, called the view from the ground. And nor can they be a substitute for something that's very important to me, almost sacred to me, and that is a little word, and that little word is form. Not a word you hear much these days. What is form? Well, I write to a form. That's one of the burdens of the columnist. I have 850 words, max. And usually what I write is initially longer. So then what happens? You chisel, you make choices, you fight with it, you distill it. And probably in the end, you end up with something better. There's not much new to form. I mean, Aristotle defined form in poetics. Something has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has some universal significance. It has a structure. It has a unity of theme. Narrative requires form. Good journalism requires form. Because without form, what do you have? You have chaos. And chaos, while it can spark all kinds of emotions, doesn't help understanding. And I think the danger of the web is the great formless deluge it offers. There's certainly liberation within it, and it's made it impossible for, very, very difficult at least, for closed societies to exist. It's been a tremendous weapon against totalitarianism. It's been a tremendous form of liberation. But if you're not careful, I think it can also be a form of imprisonment. Now, I better end. I've gone on a little more than 10 minutes, I think. But, what happened in Iran? Why were all the mainstream media, MSM as we're called these days. I mean, why were we all thrown out? Because I think that for all the presence of the new media, of this vast array of images, of words, of tweets, you know, the Iranians were worried that, you know, people like Mike, like myself, the hundreds of journalists who they'd invited to this great electoral fest, you know, which suddenly turned into a nightmare, that if we were there, you know, able to distill, to uncover, to give form, to continue to report, in short, they would not, or it would have been much more difficult for them to go ahead with this vicious clampdown that is still ongoing. So I do think that we in the MSM still count. We still bring something that certainly the Iranians were sufficiently afraid of to want us all out of there. I just conclude by saying, please don't forget Iran. It was the #1 trending topic on Twitter for a long time. It no longer is. But the fight of the Iranian people for some greater degree of freedom is ongoing. The show trials that are happening at the moment are shameful. The deaths of certainly upwards of 70 and perhaps hundreds of people, many of them tortured. There are accounts of mass rape of men and women in prisons since June 12. A small coterie of very ruthless people has grabbed the reins of power. And President Ahmadinejad is coming to the United Nations on the 23rd of September to make a speech. And I think it's important that he be reminded, by all means possible, that the world, the United States, is still watching and is appalled by the betrayal of the legitimate democratic aspirations, the centennial democratic aspirations of the Iranian people. Thank you.
I just got a note saying should all the students standing by the door be invited to move in, but I'm not sure there's anywhere for them to move in.
There's some room around here.
If we could, anyone who has a seat or knows there's some space, right? Okay, you see some hands? There are some. If people who are at the front of the line could come in, then at least a few more could get in.
One over here, one right down there.
Sorry, Mel.
Okay, Mike. Roger talked about the role of the journalist as engaging in a distillation. I've always thought of it as my role is to bring coherence to an incoherent world. When a lot of the things that I've been tasked to cover amount to chaos or incoherence. War is like that, and what happened in Iran in June is like that. It was an enormous event involving millions of people with different political aspirations, with different secret goals, with different measures of power, with different measures of violence. I work for a news organization, as Roger did, that sent one person, a single person, to try to make sense out of what was going on, form it in our form is 4 or 5 minute little pieces of speech on the radio with my voice and other people's voices. But the form for me and for the people that I work with is meant to capture the imagination of the listener. It's meant to grasp your ears and thereby your mind and keep you locked in this relationship between me and you for the amount of time that they give me to be on the radio and tell you in as vivid a way as possible what's happening to bring coherence to an incoherent situation. In that sense, I've learned over the years to use whatever means are available to gather information to make coherent sense out of a difficult situation, and that involves fundamentally talking to as many people as possible. But it also involves looking at what others have reported, because there are eyes and ears out there in our profession and who are doing the same thing, and they may uncover different information. Sometimes it's contradictory, and you're called upon to try to reconcile the contradictions. It's a very difficult job. And this is a job that's aggravated by the fact that there's a premium on speed in journalism, and when you do things fast, sometimes you get them wrong. And therefore, when every second of the day is your deadline, you're more likely to get something wrong than if the deadline is 8 hours away and you have time to check your information and gather still, so that you have a greater body of information to distill or bring coherence to in that process. But one of the things that I thought I would talk about a little bit is context and background, and the role of the journalist in providing that. I have been going to Iran for the last 5 years now. I've made at least 2 trips to Iran every year since 2004, sometimes more than 2 in a year. And I've been covering elections there as well as lots of other things in Iran, because they hold a lot. Actually, they hold a lot of elections in Iran. That there have been 2 presidential elections during this period. There have been 2 parliamentary elections during this period. There was one election during this period, the 5 years that I've been going there, for local and town councils, and there was also an election for something called the Assembly of Experts, which was an important election a couple of years ago that chooses 86 people who have the power to determine who the supreme leader of Iran is, and to determine whether he's doing a good enough job and should be left in power or should be replaced. And all of these elections have also been important, I think, for the context of what we saw in June. And I began to feel very uneasy about the electoral process, particularly the way votes are counted in the last couple of years. I'm sure that all of you have heard about the Guardian Council and the Guardian Council's role in determining who can actually run for office. This started big in 2004 during the election for the parliament then, because there were several thousand candidates who wanted to run for a seat in parliament, and they were disqualified by the Guardian Council, which is a handful of jurists and clerical figures who have the power to say, no, you can't run. And this was a big story at the time, and it's why NPR started to send me and others to Iran. What was interesting about the mood, Roger talked about how you had to be there to get the feeling of the mood. There was a great deal of fear in 2004, and this was interesting because this was coming at the end of Mohammad Khatami's second term. There was a president who had been a reformer. He had won 2 elections overwhelmingly. He had not been able to reform the system in the ways that he and others hoped that he could. And by 2004, there was a fear in the streets, and there was a fear around the polling places. I remember people coming up to me, because you pull out a microphone and a tape recorder, and people know you're from somewhere else, and they were always happy to learn that it was the United States that you were from, and they had a lot of things to say, mostly in private, about where the country was headed. The next year was the presidential election that ended Khatami's term and began the term of a new president, and this was the first election that Ahmadinejad won, and it was suspicious. It went to 2 rounds, and the way that the vote counting was announced made you feel uneasy. There's just something wrong about it, and in fact, some in Iran did charge that it had been that fraud had taken place during that election, but those reformers chose to accept Ahmadinejad's election. And then last year there was another parliamentary election, and those who were permitted to run for office were even fewer reformers and even more conservatives. But during the 3 years up until that point that Ahmadinejad was president, there had actually been breaks in the conservative coalition in Iran, some very prominent conservatives had realized that Ahmadinejad was making a mess of the country. His economic policies were a disaster. He had in focusing on Israel and the kind of rhetoric that he used, had done a disservice to the Iranian nation, and that many conservatives had concluded that this in total had become bad for Iran. And so there were different factions of conservatives that were running for parliament last year. And the Interior Ministry is the mechanism that runs an election and that counts the votes. This is completely wrong as far as elections and electoral integrity is concerned, because this is the Interior Ministry in Iran is actually not even fully under the control of the president. It's under the control of conservatives, most likely more the supreme leader than the president. And they're free to do whatever they want with the ballots. They didn't, and I was there last year, and there was no final tally about who won. It was bizarre. I waited for days, and there was never an accumulation of information where you could say, these conservatives won, these conservatives lost. There were a handful of reformers. It was impossible to tell in the immediate aftermath of the election just what kind of a parliament Iran was going to have. And this was done, I think, deliberately by the Interior Ministry in order to obfuscate, in order to confuse the public, and to confuse lawmakers, I think, as well, and politicians. So you come to now this election. And the one thing I would say about all these other trips that I've made to Iran is that there was a kind of grimness about Iranian politics. It was very easy to meet people from the opposition during all these trips. And in the aftermath of the Carnegie administration, which had disappointed so many people, there was no clarity about where to go, where the reform movement was going to go. And there was a lot of backbiting and a lot of struggling, and nobody knew what the next step was going to be. Arriving in Tehran 5 days before this election, it was entirely different. It was extraordinary. I mean, there was an excitement in the streets bordering on hysteria almost. There was a shared belief that this is going to change everything on the part of people who wanted to vote for Mousavi. The campaign had exploded in a matter of weeks, and thousands of people were demonstrating. There were thousands of people every day almost in one part of the city or another. And you just had this feel, particularly I did, after having been there so many times and seen the sort of grim reality of uncertainty in Iranian politics, that people really knew that something was going to change. And I think that their thought process was logical. Mohammad Khatami, the previous reformist president, had won 2 elections overwhelmingly with 65-70% of the vote. Those people were going to vote for Mousavi this time around. You could tell it by the excitement in the streets. That's why, for me, the result, when it was announced soon after the polls closed in June, was ridiculous. Because you knew that the people who voted for Mohammad Khatami were not going to turn around in large numbers and vote for Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Because there was so much excitement about the return of reformist politics to Iran as a powerful force. And that's why I believe that immediately so many people came out in the streets, because they understood these basic facts about Iranian politics and had the experience of the Khatami period, the 8 years of the Khatami period, and then the backlash of the conservatives in bringing Ahmadinejad into power. A couple of things I can say about the new media. What was really interesting about all the new means of communication is that ultimately the government of Iran shut down all of them. This was, I forget the precise date, but there was one night when I couldn't use anything to gather on the computer to gather information or file. I file by sending audio files through the internet to NPR that are then assembled into pieces at the other at the other end. And I stay in a hotel, a very nice little hotel in the middle of Tehran that has high-speed wireless connection, and it is just superb for sending this material to NPR and getting it on the air. Well, the internet shut down. It wasn't just the SMS texting, which was used to organize the political campaign, and it wasn't just the cell phone system that went down, but the internet too went down. That particular night, we had to rely on the old telephone to get through to me so that I could be on the air. That worked, actually. But what was really interesting to me was they can't keep it down forever. They can't do, no government can stop these mechanisms from being used forever. They might have interfered with communications on that night. I'd say from 10 o'clock in the evening until the next morning, it was impossible to communicate through the computer and the internet. But then it came back up. And the reason that it came back up is because it's necessary for governing. And therefore, it gave the journalists the possibility of sending more information, and it gave the public who was out there, millions strong, all taking cell phone pictures and videos. That one day of the enormous demonstration, I mean, we're talking about an enormous amount of video information taken by participants that they then could share via email or websites the pictures and the video that they had taken, because the government requires the internet as well as those challenging the government. And unless the government is capable of coming up with software that can let them have it and block everybody else, and I don't think that that's a possibility. Ultimately, I think the government in that battle will always lose. Anyway, I'll stop there.
What I have to say is kind of a compliment on the one hand, or a challenge to what Roger said. Roger looked at social media from the perspective of journalism as journalists, and he's absolutely right in everything he said about that. I've looked at social media from the perspective of the people on the ground, the people who use this information and who generate this information. So I have different perspective, and I'll just give you one. A few days ago, one of the tweeters from Iran wrote, Twitter is now all I have. My home, my friends. It just gives you the voice of a different voice on how they use Twitter. I myself was 30 years ago an anti-Khomeini activist, a junior member of the Faculty of Social Sciences at Tehran, working with human rights groups. I was the first to get beaten up by the first group of thugs, the forerunners of the Basidis at Tehran University. And I took 3 journalists, French and British, to interview Khamenei, now the supreme leader, and I got into serious trouble for that. I left Iran at the end of 1980, haven't been back, but believe me, over the past 3 months, I have been reliving that experience every moment of it, the exhilaration and the disaster, mostly on Twitter, Facebook, and other social networks. So, because you might stop me, and I might write on it, so I'll give you the sort of the ending first. I'd like to read you something, quote Madyar, who's one of my favorite tweeters and bloggers from Iran, who was interviewed on July 17th by the New York Times on the web. He tweets from Iran. And it says his hope for the future is freedom and democracy, where no one will be imprisoned for expressing their opinions or for their writings, or tortured or hanged, that there will be a government that we elect and is on our side. When that time comes, he says, maybe I'll have the opportunity to get up from behind my computer and go to taste freedom and security and to finally understand what life is all about. Once I wrote, death to this dictator who made me spend my entire life, my entire youth behind a PC. In 1978-79, Khomeini used a series of audio cassette tapes that he disseminated secretly in Iran to communicate his message and to mobilize the public and organize demonstrations. In 2009, The opposition, as we all know, used SMS and cell phone technology and social media to do the same. More than 30 million people have access to the internet in Iran, and the same number have access to cell phones. I say that the difference between those two media used in 79 and 2009 actually spells the difference between the very essence of these two movements. In 78, 79, a premeditated fixed message was created and delivered by one charismatic leader on a physical object and disseminated secretly in mosques and bazaars. In 09, a message evolved in real time through a mix of accidental leaders and masses of ordinary people and disseminated openly in cyberspace. The open, friendly social media became the message. We want an open, friendly society. Let's all have a conversation. Let's have some democracy. Whereas 30 years ago, the exclusive cassettes spelled something like, I am the one, just follow my orders, end of discussion, beginning of dictatorship. I've identified the top 3 effects of social media on the opposition movement, and I will go through them as I have time. One is what has been said, that they help activate, empower, and unify the opposition en masse, and very importantly, gave them hope. 2 is that they showed us the face of Iranians as we never knew them in recent years. And 3 is they globalized the movement. There is a 4th important one, but that's in the works. I really don't know. I have a couple of quotes, but I cannot comment on too much. And that is that they helped or are helping radicalize the message. And that is not something to be overlooked. Under sort of activated the message, there was a poll taken by an American company between May 11 and May 20th that showed, this is before the candidates have been formally announced, but people know more or less who's running. It showed Ahmadinejad in the lead 2-1. Ahmadinejad had 34% and Mousavi had 14%. But 52% were unaccounted for, so we didn't know who they were going to vote for. May 20th, the candidates are formally announced, and they have 3 weeks to campaign. Ahmadinejad has had a lot of time to campaign. He's covered, TV covers him going to various rural areas, handing out free potatoes, justice money, as he calls it. Mousavi starts organizing the campaign on Facebook. May 23, so May 20th, the campaign starts. May 23, the government bans Facebook. Mousavi immediately starts using SMS and cell phone messages. 100 million SMS messages were communicated between this period and July 11th, when everything went dead. June 11th. 100 million messages. June 12th was the election. Morning of June 13th, the partial vote counts show Ahmadinejad in the lead by landslide, and the protests erupt immediately. And this is when protesters start posting videos of the protest and the backlash captured on cell phones. All of this is spontaneous. There is no vetting of this information by the Mousavi campaign. CNN goes live with these eye reports. June 14th, Khamenei calls Ahmadinejad something divine and bans the protests and threatens the crackdown. But June 14th, Change for Iran, which is a Twitter account, says, students and people fighting back. I mean, talk about taking you onto the scene. Students and people fighting back, a large group of police and Basif right now at the University of Physics. I'm going to join them. Another one. We have now some students with urgent need of medical attention. I'm calling out to all people who can come here. Don't leave us. June 15, when the biggest rallies, over 30 years, are held in Tehran and other cities. Persian Wiki, one of everybody's favorite Twitters who has disappeared and we very much fear for his life, says, Streets very dangerous now. Groups of militia on motorbikes searching for protesters. More than 100 students missing from Tehran University dorms. Reports of several dead from last night. And so it goes on. There is a lot of not just information, but a request for help and presence in particular places being exchanged on Twitter. June 16 to 20 is when the foreign media either stopped from reporting or actually asked to leave. And that's when the citizen reporters become an institution. Iran election trends, number one. Musavi, by the way, I forgot to mention that once he started SMS and cell phone messaging, the same week he went on Twitter. And that is when Iran election started to trend. So it stays a trending topic. Groups and forums are being formed on Facebook at internet speed. Other kinds of information start getting posted, including, for instance, somebody posts the home of the chief of Basij on Google Earth and urges everybody else to post homes of other Basiji on Google Earth. June 18 is when Google Translate is added for Persian English. And this is marvelous, but also hilarious. A guy from Texas posted some videos on self-defense. There was a lot of information about self-defense being exchanged on Twitter against the Basij. A guy from Texas posted some videos, and because he's using Google Translation, simultaneously get the bilingual. One of the posts said, defending against security dogs, and this translates into English as, or into Persian as, defending the security of dogs. June 19, all eyes are on Rafsanjani's Friday sermon, which was very critical as to whether he was going to back the opposition, push them to get out there more or not. I discovered on Twitter an LA-based radio that streamed the sermon live and that took calls from Iran. All night that night, I sat up and tweeted, in translation, of course, translated everything that I was hearing, and I got off my computer about 7:30 in the morning. What I want to say is that people, inside and outside, were tuned in and were using the social media, not just for information, but to actually stay alive, energized, hopeful, and that's very critical. You were asking about the consumer and its use of social media. So, as the government blocked reporters and social media on and off in different ways, the Green Movement tagline became, "You are the media." And this has become a really real identity marker for people who are using social media. There is a cartoon of two mullahs standing on a window, on a balcony with thousands of people down below with their cell phones and emails and so forth. And one of the mullahs says, "Arrest the correspondents," and the other one says, "But they're all correspondents." And there's another one recalling another event with three, this is wonderful, I forgot to bring the copy, 3 tanks lining up. There's this, in the front tank there are 2 mullahs, and one guy is standing there with his little cell phone, and one of the mullahs says, "He's twittering." So, I want to point out that along with the information about events on the ground, there was a lot of commentary posted on blogs, on YouTube, videos, in Persian and in English. That is absolutely a revelation for anybody who wants to know what were these people thinking coming on the streets. And this, even on press TV, in English, there's commentary against the government. So you're sort of surprised that they would allow even such negative commentary to be posted. But press TV is now being called by somebody oppressed TV. The government's response to all this is best captured by the title. So to the government, of course, blocked is the only thing they felt they could do. They they weren't clever enough to get their own messages out in this so friendly way out to the people. Their response is best captured by the title of a Human Rights Documentation Center report on Iran, published in May at Yale. It's called Control, Alt, Delete, Iran's response to the internet. So to the skeptics who sort of believe the role of social media is overrated, I just point out a couple of other things. The indictment of the mass trial of the detainees named social media, specifically Facebook, Twitter, and even Google Persian translated as complicit. I only have a few minutes. I'm going to have to cut through. So, I would say the world got to know Iranians. I'd say that Neda, perhaps the image of the protester on the street was best captured in the image of Neda, the innocence, here's a woman who's taking singing lessons, for heaven's sake. The image that best captured the movement's leadership, I think, was a before and after picture of Abtahi, who was former VP of Khatami, a reformist, big blogger, and who before was a plum cleric, cheerful, and after sitting in the trial, he's haggard and lean and without his turban and really looking depressing. And as for showing the face of the regime, and I don't think any of this information could have been exchanged without social media. A video was posted of a secretly taped meeting between Ahmadinejad, Mesbah Yazdi, who is Khamenei is bad, this guy is badder, in Qom, sitting around with about 20 other people, talking about what is happening today. This was posted on Twitter about 2 or 3 months, or it's dated 2 or 3 months before the election, and they're talking about planning what sounds like a cultural revolution. They're talking about the universities. They're now being, social sciences and humanities are being cut down. They're talking about us, that is Ahmadinejad saying, we're ready, the university is ready, the Revolutionary Guard is ready, all we need is your theoretical or theological and practical support, and we'll do it. So there's a lot of mounting evidence that much of what's happening today was planned in a sort of Gang of Four style cultural revolution, I think. Very importantly, the social media globalized the national movement. It really engaged the Iranian diaspora, which is not even a community, really hasn't had a community identity in ways absolutely impossible before. So people are now connecting with and writing to people who they know only through their Twitter avatars. This would not have been possible without the social media. Outsiders, of course, became a channel for information and moral support. It's interesting, Zahra Rahnavard, the wife of Mousavi, who went on Twitter early but quit, she switched to Facebook. She tweeted, do you want to know what Iranians fighting, this is June 30th, do you want to know what Iranians fighting for the rights want from you citizens of the world? And she gives a link to a story that is happening on this corner of a street corner in New York with a professor from Columbia, a Persian professor from Columbia, talking about this is the Iranian civil rights movement, quoting Martin Luther King Jr. and so on. So here's a woman who's been actually a very important voice and leader in the movement, linking you to the streets of New York and is saying, this is what we want from you people outside the rest of the world. I won't list the technical support that was provided by outsiders, by this global community, the Tor browser bundle, Google, Twitter, I mean, the proxy servers, this guy Austin Heath in Texas collecting USB drives, thumb drives, he's collected about 650 out of his goal of 1,000 to allow people to communicate without being found out. It's just really marvelous to support. Somebody called Twitter is the global town hall meeting for the pro-democracy movement. This is an Iranian writing. And Smoky Head, a non-Iranian, says, to the leaders of Iran, we are watching you and we are anonymous. If there is time, I wanted to mention something about Nabadi, the satirist who created an I Confess video and has started this new videos of people confessing, Iranians and non-Iranians, to being members of the perpetrators of the Velvet Revolution. It's absolutely hilarious. So the conversation is going on not just on the level of information, but on interpreting and participating on more sort of artistic, if you will, creative levels. In conclusion, I want to go back to the poll that I mentioned before. And this is important for knowing who are these people that Roger talks about who are on the streets of Tehran. Nearly, in that poll that I mentioned, May 11 to 20, nearly 4 in 5 Iranians, so this is before Mousavi has gained a presence, before the Green Movement. Nearly 4 in 5 Iranians, including most Ahmadinejad supporters, said they wanted to change the political system to give them the right to elect Iran's supreme leader, who is not currently subject to popular vote. Similarly, Iranians chose free elections and a free press as their most important priorities. This virtually tied with their economic priorities in the economic field. 77% favored normal relations and trade with the United States. So where are we now? Mousavi has announced just 2 days ago that the movement is to get off the streets, into homes, small cells of people talking to each other and not stopping ever. The comment, there's a comment on Mousavi's webpage this morning, says, regime's threat to arrest Khatami, Mousavi, and Karoubi shows they don't understand the essence of the opposition, which is spontaneous, self-governing, self-generating. It's the Green Movement. And so my prediction is that people will continue to use social media to the best of their abilities. People outside will help them get around some of the blocks. And if there is time, anybody is interested, afterwards I can tell you how radicalized the messages are becoming, even against Mousavi, Karoubi, and others, let alone against the regime as a whole. So the message that is growing up out of this social media is an Iranian republic crossing out Islam. Thank you.
So we've used all our time, but if you need to go to class, go ahead. Otherwise, we'll stick around for the. You okay, Mike? Okay, we'll stick around for a while and answer budget-based questions. I didn't want to cut people off because they were too interesting. So let's let people clear out for just a second, and then we'll those who would like to cut class, you're very welcome here. Okay, questions? And try to keep the question short because we're going to have to get out of here pretty soon. So go ahead.
First of all, I want to thank all three of you as someone, expat who watches and wishes for the last 30 years and doesn't think much of that, but what you guys do. But this is the thing, you talked about context, and I do believe that there is the value of journalism, or real journalism, to be able to interpret things in the context of history and what they know generally. So in that context, how much hope do you see, supposing that there is a regime change in Iran, how much hope do you see for the people of Iran, for democracy in Iran? And if people like Mousavi and Karoubi, who are perhaps of the same breed as Khatami, reformers, but still from the House of Mullahs. If they take over, is there going to be real significant change in Iran? I mean, Khatami had 2 terms and not much happened.
Mike, you want to? Well, it's impossible for me to be a predictor of events. I'm convinced that this is just a period of a lull, and that the movement will return to the streets in force. I don't doubt that for a minute. But achieving clear political goals that could bring consensus and unity to the Iranian body politic is an enormously difficult task. What we saw in June and July didn't demonstrate that thought process and that political process had advanced very far. And it could be a very bloody process. I think both Roger and I, when we attended the huge demonstration that is said to be in the more than 2 million, maybe 3 million people on June 15th, you could imagine the regime fighting back using violence, most likely violence from the air, to attack demonstrations of that size. And so I fear that this is going to be a bloody process. It can't be a bloodless process. It hasn't been already. How the Iranian body politic, how Iranians will sort all that out, and whether they'll come to the republic, not the Islamic Republic, and whether it will somehow represent a broad enough consensus that it could establish a stable democratic government, I don't know. I just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, no, anybody who says they can predict the future in Iran is lying. It's in a state of such flux right now that I don't think anybody knows, not in the Obama administration, not in this room, not anywhere. I think there have been a couple of sea changes in Iran that are significant for the future. One is that the millions of Iranians in their 30s, 20s and 30s, who I would say were in a mode of what I've called reluctant acquiescence. People I talked to when I was there in January, February said, look, it's bad, but once every 4 years we get to nudge the system this way or that way. It's not true that the elections are unimportant. I mean, Khatami was different from Ahmadinejad, and not as different as we would have liked, perhaps, but he was different. So these people thought, well, this time we'll get to nudge it back in the reformist direction with Mousavi, and we can, okay, the Velayat Faqih, the supreme leader, is a system that we don't like, but we'll find a way. Well, I think that's over. I think a lot of people who were in that reluctant, acquiescent mode have moved into outright opposition. And that is a very significant shift. The election, I think, showed that this is a very, very curious system. I mean, you have this election, and then you have this guy who is standing in for the hidden imam, I mean, ultimately standing in for the prophet, who is disconnected from the masses, disconnected from everything, and it's hard to see, how you have an evolution of that system. So I think, as Mike said, that could in the end be, hard to resolve without violence. But I think Ahmadinejad is without question the most divisive figure in the 30-year history of the Islamic Republic. There is significant dissent within the religious establishment, within the political establishment, where even centrists, conservatives like Larijani don't like him at all, Halibaf, others. Who knows what Rafsanjani is up to, but he's presumably up to something. I don't, they put a limit for now. They've used extreme ruthlessness, but I think the Islamic Republic is much weaker today than it was on June 11th.
In the back, yeah, Josh.
Hi. So the Iranians have a very proud history of revolution. In 1979, the Islamic Revolution that swept Iran actually was inspired by a number of different political ideologies, all of which had its hand in the revolution. And in the end, the way things have been sorted out, we wind up with a very kind of motley semi-democratic structure that reflects a lot of different interests. And the one that really won out in the end was the vision of the Ayatollah Khomeini. So again, you see the seeds of dissent that are perhaps now can be described as unsuccessful Velvet Revolution. To what extent, if these people were to be brought into power, we would then see what we saw in 1979, which is that they don't necessarily see eye to eye on everything except in their opposition of the existing power structure. That you quoted public opinion poll, and I know in the same public opinion polls, people said that they were very unhappy with the way that the supreme leadership was devolved to the Ayatollah. But just as many people want to see the Islamic Republic become more Islamic and less Republican as those that want to see the Islamic Republic become more Republican and less Islamic. So how would that play out? Question.
I don't know how anything will play out. Right now, the crackdown is continuing. Just this morning, Karoubi's office is on his website, were confiscated and shut down, and his webmaster was taken away. I mean, it's right, left, and center. There are a lot of arrests going on. Maybe they'll pick up the sort of second-level managers, and then they'll arrest Karoubi and others. And if you go by Twitter protests, people say, pick them up, arrest them. We're not going to stop because they are not, in answer to your question, we're not limited to the leaders. So when you take Mousavi and Khatami and Karoubi out of the picture, yeah, you're left with millions of people who are unhappy with the system. If you wanted to divide them in a sort of simplified way between the more Islamic or more Republican, the more Islamic is really a cult. And it is the cult that is directed by Mesbah Yazdi, the triumvirate up there. There's Mesbah Yazdi, the theoretician of this thing, where you still have a supreme leader, but none of this business of election, people, republic, forget it. That's Mesbah Yazdi. On Ahmadinejad's team, there's Mashai, who's his advisor, who's part of this thinking. I have no idea. It is impossible to tell where exactly the Revolutionary Guard stands, theologically speaking. What kind of a regime or ideology do they see will benefit them, who are the biggest corporation in Iran? Let's not forget, they're not just the military. Where people will go, they're all over the place. There are those like Mousavi who want to keep the regime. He keeps saying the Islamic Republic is the foundation of where I come from. They operate badly. They don't enact or execute the Constitution. And then there are all these others who are saying, don't ever trust. And these are people who are part of the Green Movement. Like, I'm part of the Green Movement, and I'm totally, vehemently against any intrusion of religion into politics and government. And yet, so they're saying, don't trust the opponent, don't trust anybody who is part of the Islamic Revolution, the 1979 Revolution. And they may go anywhere. If what Mousavi is proposing, this green path of hope, which they can't even stop it. The government can't even stop it because it's not even an organization. It's certainly not a party. It's not even an official front. Once this starts forming, it'll be off, I think, social media, possibly back to the streets and tracts and paper. And people will come up with different ideas of where they want to take the country.
Listen, front.
I have a very simple question. I know that Roger's and also Mike's reporting from Iran have met a lot of opposition here, from what I've read, and I know. I just wanted to know what do you think this opposition is to? What is the content? What is it that people oppose in your reporting from your own perspective? And I also wanted to ask Ms. Afshar if you could please tell us more comparative points between 79, your experience in 79 and now. I know you picked out on social media, it was a physical object and so forth, but what else do you see similar and what else do you see that's not similar?
Well, and I went to Iran in January and February, and I was there 3 weeks, and I'd been there once in the 70s, but I was basically a hippie passing through, so it was in a sense my first, well certainly, yeah, anyway, we'll gloss over that. But, yeah, you know, I went there, and you know, Tehran, Iran's a very sophisticated place, and you know, as Mike has done, I just tried, and you know, I wrote 8 or 10 columns about Iran, and they provoked vehement opposition, and you know, it was unbelievable. Actually, it still is to me. But you know, I tried to do a couple of things. One is I argue very strongly for engagement. That the non-communication between the rising power of the Middle East and the United States over 30 years was bad for Iran, bad for the United States, bad for the world, and that it was essential that we try and overcome this trauma. And it is a trauma. It's a very emotional relationship between the United States and Iran. I mean, it's the hostage crisis. It's our role in the coup in 1953. It's the shooting down of the jet in 1988. I mean, it's so many things. It's a very, very, this is not a normal relationship. This is not a normal non-relationship. It is a very emotionally charged non-relationship. And, you know, I tried to sort of sweep some of that away and talk about you know, what young people wanted, and I think a lot of that was in some ways vindicated by then what happened, because we saw the complexity of the society and the image of America, and this is a fundamental change, I think, that has a lot of importance going forward. People see Iran in a different way, and that's very important. The single 2 columns that produced the greatest ire, you know, as many people know, were the columns I wrote about the Iranian Jewish community, which is the largest, along with Turkey's, Jewish community in the Muslim Middle East. And I wanted to raise the issue with, you know, Ahmadinejad fulminating and the talk of Israel disappearing from the map. And I just thought it was worth, you know, raising the issue that this community lives here. And at the time, it was right after Gaza, and some of the Jewish community were angry about that. And there are red lines for everybody in Iran. There's red lines for, you know, you can't praise Israel, talk about Israel, you can't criticize the supreme leader, you can't organize politically. There are all kinds of ways in which Iran is unfree, which I wrote about, and for Jews, probably more so. Nevertheless, you know, I tried to portray this and a lot of people thought I was a dupe. You know, I became Duranty in the Soviet Union, Matthews in Cuba, the Red Cross at Theresienstadt. You know, I was one of the great dupes of history. You know, I had been taken in. So, you know, I don't think I was taken in. As I wrote in June, I underestimated the brutality of this regime, but I don't think I'm alone in that.
I've received the signal that we are about to be evicted, so I'm afraid we'll have to wrap up now. As we leave, perhaps you can toss in another question or two, but we have to get out of here. So.